Hello, I'm Dalton Delan. I'm a columnist for the Berkshire Eagle, and this is Eagle Reels, where we take you beyond the news. My guest today, Rabbi Ron Fish, the interim regional director for the Anti-Defamation League of New England. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate your being here. Let me start, Rabbi, with the ADL's decades-long tracking of anti-Semitic incidents. And in 2022, the last year for which I have seen numbers, there were 152 incidents in Massachusetts, which was twice 2 years before that. What accounts for this?
Thank you for highlighting our audit of anti-Semitic incidents. It is one of the core key areas of our expertise, and it's a critical component of fighting hate, fighting anti-Semitism in the United States. It's relied upon by members of the law enforcement community. It's relied upon by Jewish community leaders across the nation. And the numbers have been staggering. There has been a rise over the last decade that is really without precedent. Since we've begun studying these numbers in 1979, we had historically seen kind of lowering numbers over the decades. There were areas in the 1990s, early 2000s, there were periods of time where we really genuinely felt hopeful that we would see a time where perhaps anti-Semitism might become increasingly insignificant as a challenge in the United States. Things have turned in a dark direction, and dramatically so. The reality is that political leaders matter. When people open the door to extremism and hate, when people articulate an openness to working with the kinds of extremists who engage in hateful rhetoric against Jews, against members of the LGBTQ plus community, against Black Americans, against others, that speech has real-world implications. We've seen similar openness to hate by people who lead social media companies, by people who are socially engaged in spaces, including music and other areas of culture, where they engage in opening the door as well to praising Hitler or to being open to insane, crazy ideas like Holocaust denial. All of these areas of speech may in some sense be protected, certainly under the First Amendment. But what they've done is they've given a green light to extremists here in the Commonwealth and around the country to engage in more and more dangerous activity. We don't have the numbers for release today as I'm speaking with you, but the 2023 audit of anti-Semitic incidents will undoubtedly be jaw-dropping. We've tracked since October 7th, in the 6 months since that horrific attack on Jewish people, Israelis in Israel, we have tracked a 400% nearly increase in anti-Semitic acts in the United States, and in Europe and other parts of the world, it's even double that. The idea that people would protest against Israel's behavior or policies or conduct of the war, that is not anti-Semitic in and of itself. But the idea that such statements of delegitimization, of dehumanization of Israelis that we hear too often on college campuses and other spaces are simple political speech, it's simply belied by the fact that those words have unleashed so much hate against Jews in this country.
Rabbi Fish, the anti-Zionism, as it were, that you're speaking about, I think in the public mind, rather than those who are busy, ranting on social media, I think it's legitimately confusing. Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. Are we allowed to have problems with Netanyahu or the prosecution of the war in Gaza? Where does that move into anti-Semitism? Could you help unpack that for us?
Yes, it's a really important question, and I want to be as clear as I can. I said it before, I'll say it again. It's certainly not anti-Semitic to challenge Israeli policy, to take issue with Israeli actions. It's not anti-Semitic to oppose any political leader of any kind. Certainly Bibi Netanyahu, who is probably the most unpopular politician in Israel right now, opposing him is not an anti-Semitic act. It's just not. What we've seen is not reasonable, thoughtful critique of Israel. What we've seen is not simply taking issue with Israeli policy. What we've seen, which we describe as anti-Zionism, is an outright claim that Jews and Jews alone do not have the right to collective sovereignty anywhere in the world. You know, the notion of Zionism has been so demonized that in many quarters, the word Zionism is seen as a synonym for white supremacy or for a form of hate itself, which it's difficult even to process. Zionism is the radical idea that Jews are people who have the same rights and the same responsibilities as other people. And Jewish Zionist dreams, the idea of being a sovereign in our historic homeland, can be entirely consonant with the belief in Palestinian rights and Palestinian nationalism. Those can live side by side. It's in fact a reversal of the reality to say that Zionism makes that impossible, when in fact it is the people who perpetrated an intentional act of mass murder of civilians by the 1,000 plus, that they were the ones who were attempting to make coexistence impossible. If anything, coexistence, however it comes about, will probably require borders. And what we saw in the case of Gaza on October 7th was that the border was not only not respected, but even people's homes, people's kitchens were the places of their murder and their rape. And in order for Jews, for Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side, we have to take seriously the idea that we have to respect the legitimacy of all communities. And the delegitimizing of the Jewish people, the belief that the Jewish people and the Jewish people alone do not have collective rights, that is a belief system which fundamentally says the human rights that apply to others don't apply to Jews. The word for that is anti-Semitism.
Rabbi Fish, as I'm listening to you, I'm realizing something that I've been observing as a journalist in the last few years, which is that something that we thought previously was the province of, far right and white supremacist type of belief and propaganda now seems to join with actually a progressive left anti-colonial movement that appears now to be conflated here with Palestine, and so it's like a perfect storm or a horrible sandwich of the left and the right. Would you say that's correct? Scylla and Charybdis right now?
Yeah, the moment we're in is certainly without precedent in my lifetime. And it is, in fact, a moment where Jews are sort of shaking their heads in disbelief in most cases, saying, how is it possible that the people we thought we were allied with are not standing with us in the face of the atrocities of October 7th? Even, by the way, before Israel began its military response, we saw, for instance, the SJP, so-called Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at Tufts University, praised the attack, called it glorious. The idea that people could do that in the face of such brutality was stunning. And in the name, by the way, of social justice and liberation and anti-colonialism, it is such a distortion of the values that are necessary for human liberation. The challenge that we face is for sure from the right, where we see an increased openness to delegitimize Jews and to attack Jewish presence in all sorts of spaces. We've had a rise on the right of these groups called the city council death squads, where they Zoom bomb or they just take over a public forum. They misuse the free speech space that the community provides to spread invective and lies about Jews. That's happened all over the Commonwealth. And at the same time, we see, as you point out, on college campuses, these progressive spaces have risen up and seen somehow that Jews are, in almost classically anti-Semitic terms, demonic, failure to see the humanity of Jews in these conflicts at all, failure to see Jewish suffering. In many ways, this brings us back to an analysis of anti-Semitism as a phenomenon. The truth is about anti-Semitism doesn't necessarily require an understanding of Judaism, and it doesn't even really mean anything about Jews. Anti-Semitism is kind of the decoder ring through a conspiracy theory that says somehow when there's something wrong in the world, if you look at the decoder ring, it will tell you how the Jews are at the source of all that is off, that is troubling, that is problematic in our world. It's why in the early part of the 20th century, communists would describe Jews as capitalists. You know, they would raise up the name of the Rothschild family, for example, and why capitalists like Henry Ford decided what was wrong with the world was the fault of the Jews, who were all communists. So how is it possible that that could be true? Were there Jews who were capitalists? Yes. Were there Jews who were communists? Yes. But Jews, because they were people, were part of these movements. What was uniquely true was that this decoder ring defined these problems as tracing back to Jews. And in many ways, the scary moment we're in seems to remind us that whether you look on the right or the left, if they're looking for simple answers, the Jewish community often is the target of those communities' attempts to make sense of a complex world.
Rabbi Fish, you mentioned the Tufts example. We all saw very publicly in hearings the MIT and Harvard examples as well. But it isn't just campuses. An area that I know is in your background as well as mine is neighboring Connecticut, Fairfield County. A friend of mine has had a terrible experience recently with one of his children in junior high there with severe anti-Semitism. How much is the ADL seeing? Is this coursing through younger grades in public schools, not just university campuses?
It undoubtedly is. What we're seeing does express itself in middle schools and high schools across the country. And we should make sure to remind ourselves this is not just a phenomenon of the margins of our societies. This is now happening in good school systems, and it's happening across the board. The danger is a danger that pushes people to feel as though they are fighting this fight alone. ADL has been fighting against anti-Semitism and against all forms of hate for 111 years. We know that it requires a coalition of decent people, people who are themselves targets in other instances, to come together and fight on behalf of everyone who is targeted. And that's why we build coalitions with the LGBTQ plus community, with Black leaders and communities, with the Hispanic community, and even with the Muslim community. It's difficult right now, but we believe that this can't be solved alone. You know, the problem of anti-Black racism is not for Black people to solve. It's for the entirety of the society. And the problem of anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It is a problem of our society to address. We're grateful that the Biden administration released their White House plan on fighting anti-Semitism with a lot of input from the ADL. This plan now needs to be implemented on the national level through all the departments of the federal government, needs to be implemented at the state level, and needs to be implemented on the local level. We should tolerate no anti-Semitism. And whether you're Jewish, or even, maybe I'd say especially if you're not, we ask you to step up and do your part.
Rabbi Fish, in what you're talking about, and you referenced a situation for LGBTQ+, I mean, I think there's an old adage, first they come for the Jews. And then who's next if you let that happen, right? And I think that there has been a surge in hate crimes, and I think an appalling statistic for the Commonwealth is that the white supremacist propaganda, I think you all have noted, as Massachusetts ranking second in the nation for that. That seems very troubling.
It does indeed. Actually, I think our new numbers show that we in Massachusetts are the fifth highest in the nation. Not to get too technical on you, but I think it's important to recall that we're the fifth largest in the nation. We're not the fifth largest state. And the growth of this phenomenon of extremist literature, which targets all of the communities we've been referencing, is a very present reality here. Way beyond our numbers in the nation, and we've seen this, whether it's in the form, as I mentioned before, of these city council meetings and others that have been disrupted by white extremists. Sometimes we call them Christian nationalists and others. These groups who articulate the most horrific views, talking even recently about Jews being behind 9/11. Other kinds of conspiracy theories, which seem like they should have no place in our society. One thing we have to really put on the table, and this is partly the fault of social media, partly the fault of other forces in our society. When conspiracy theories thrive, marginalized communities are the most endangered, and the Jewish community has known that profoundly in our past. It is really important to emphasize that the fight against hate begins with a consistent commitment to truth. And it is exactly that commitment to truth which is fraying right now. It is why we believe very strongly that for all that social media brings people potentially together, it is really the responsibility of those platforms to fight against hate in those spaces and to not tolerate the ways in which those spaces can become really a cesspool for the worst parts of human discourse.
Rabbi Fish, I've heard you speak in other arenas about a very counterintuitive demographic trend where that what we used to think that the youth would be more enlightened, that this has flipped. And as we've talked about already in schools and campuses, is this a result of social media, the war on Gaza? What is going on?
So, yeah, we have been tracking, and since 1964, 11 tropes that are considered to be definitive kind of markers of anti-Semitic attitudes. And if a person answers 6 of them, that they believe 6 of these 11, we say that they are demarcated as a person holding significantly anti-Semitic views. By the way, I think if you answered 3 of them right or 2 of them right, it's also troubling. But we're talking only about the 6. So just a few years ago, I think it was 2019, the number who answered 6 of those tropes in the affirmative was around 10% of Americans. And it was disproportionately older Americans who held those views. You are correct. In our most recent study, it's almost a quarter of Americans, 24% of Americans hold 6 or more of these significantly anti-Semitic views. And among Gen Z and among millennials, those views are more widely held than they are among older Americans. So what happened? Why do we have this flip? There is a real problem that social media produces just a kind of a payoff for these companies to provide more and more outrageous material, which inures people to hate. It is certainly the case that younger people are exposed to ideas today that increasingly erase Zionist Jewish identity as a legitimate way to be in the world. There are many spaces, broadly, you could think of them as progressive spaces, that have erased the fact that, for example, Israel is majority people who trace their ancestry to North Africa, the Middle East, in Iran or Persia, people who would be considered people of color in the United States. And yet Zionism is equated with white supremacy somehow. There are people who believe that in the spirit of social justice, they stand up against colonialism and imperialism, and they somehow believe Zionism is the purest example of that in the world. That is reinforced in many, many ways through the discourse of academia, and as it trickles down into the discourse that exists in many younger spaces where they feel that they're standing up for what's right. The great tragedy is, of course, that Zionism is the ultimate expression of indigeneity, the return to a homeland, and Zionism, of course, as a political movement, is open to all kinds of analysis and discussion and disagreement. But Zionism does not, at its core, say there's anything but a capacity to share this land. In fact, again and again, back to the 1920s, the Zionist movement has sought avenues to express the Jewish dream of some place to be sovereign alongside Palestinian Arab attempts to do the same, to share the land. It is such a tragedy that people have been taught to think of Jews as in this rigid class that we might call people of privilege or people of power, when in fact the Jewish community is a community that has known such refugee status, such oppression, in such recent terms, that it should be the case Jews are perceived as a community that has thankfully succeeded, perhaps beyond our expectations, in the building of a thriving democracy for all of the contradictions that are present in many democracies. And we need to really lean in to reteaching just what Zionism is all about. It's not easy because people like bumper stickers, and bumper stickers to say all of that and more don't work. We need people to invest in seeking the truth. Conflicts are bloody and painful, and I grieve over the Palestinian losses in this current war, but that grief does not negate the Jewish capacity, the Jewish right to be a people. That is who we are, and we must be seen to have the same rights as others.
Rabbi Fish, with all we've talked about here, let me just give you a last word on what gives you hope.
It's a question I get asked quite often at the end of these dark conversations, and I understand why people would assume it's sort of hard to muster some kind of hope at the end of such a rehearsal of all the things that seem to be going wrong. But let's take a breath. The world has plenty of troubles. The world has plenty of challenges, and in many ways, this moment is unique in my lifetime. But we also have so many tools at our disposal to fight just these problems. There is no question at all that if we have the will as a democratic society, as people who are committed to working against extremism and hate, if we have the will to push back against those forces, we have the ability to do it. It requires teaching our children with subtlety and with conviction that all people have dignity. It involves calling the truth. And when people are engaged in acts of hate or dehumanization, to stand up and have the courage to tell the truth in the face of such hate. When we do that together, there are many more of us than there are of the extremists, and we can achieve great things. I would say that even in this dark moment, maybe especially at this dark moment, you can see the light. You know, if you hold a candle in the middle of broad daylight, you can barely see there's any light coming from it at all. Well, we're about to have an eclipse here in the Northeast, and it's going to get dark in the middle of the day. But it's when the darkness comes that you can see the lights. And I see the lights in people like the family in Newton, where their home was vandalized, where they displayed hostage posters. They've stood up, they're bringing people together, and they're expressing hope. I see hope in the form of many of our political leaders who are standing up for what's right and insisting that these extremists do not have a place in their political tent. And I see hope even maybe in Israel in this strange moment where Jews and Arabs and Muslims are coming together inside Israel to continue insisting that the dream of coexistence and peace is not dead, that we will work to restore humanity and peace where everybody has a space. It takes a little bit of confidence and vision to see those glimmers of light in a dark time. But if you look carefully, you can see all those points of light all throughout our world and certainly in the Commonwealth. And that light will have the last word. We will not let light be eclipsed.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Rabbi Ron Fish, Interim Regional Director, the ADL New England, for a fantastic conversation on a very difficult topic. Viewers, I hope this has helped you understand. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you are a subscriber to the Berkshire Eagle. If you are already, thank you. If you haven't yet become a subscriber, please consider becoming one. This is how we have these conversations. This is how we right the ship of information and truth in this country and locally here in the Berkshires. I'm Dalton Delan. I'll see you next time on Eagle Reels and in the pages of the Berkshire Eagle.